When headlines start with the word breaking, most people assume something explosive has just happened. A dramatic courtroom confession, a judge slamming down a ruling that changes everything, a legal strategy unraveling in real time. But sometimes what truly shakes a high-profile case isn't one loud moment. It's a series of smaller shifts that quietly change the direction of the story. And that's exactly why so many royal watchers are asking whether Prince Harry's latest court battle has hit a turning point that's far more serious than anyone expected. For years now, Prince Harry has positioned himself not just as a royal figure navigating life outside the palace walls, but as someone on a mission. A mission to challenge what he sees as an intrusive, aggressive media culture. A mission rooted deeply in his personal history, particularly in the trauma surrounding the death of his mother, Princess Diana. For him, these legal fights aren't abstract policy debates. They are emotional, personal, symbolic. That emotional weight is part of what has drawn such intense attention to every court appearance, every filing, every statement issued by his legal team. But emotion alone doesn't win cases. And when observers began noticing subtle signals that the momentum may not be fully in his favor, the narrative started to shift. It's important to understand the broader context of Harry's legal battles. Since stepping back from official royal duties in 2020 and relocating to the United States with Meghan, he has pursued several legal actions in the United Kingdom, primarily centered around media conduct and personal security arrangements. Each case has been watched closely, not just because of his status as a royal, but because of what the outcomes might signal about the evolving relationship between public figures and the press. In courtrooms, strategy is everything. Timing, framing, evidence, witness credibility, all of it matters. And in high-profile cases, perception often runs parallel to legal reality. When reports began circulating that certain arguments were facing pushback, that certain claims were being scrutinized more intensely than anticipated, critics were quick to interpret those developments as cracks in the foundation. To be clear, crumbles is a dramatic word. Legal processes rarely collapse overnight. What tends to happen instead is erosion. Confidence erodes. Public sympathy erodes. The aura of inevitability erodes. And when that happens in a case that's already under a global microscope, the consequences extend beyond the courtroom. Part of what makes this moment so complex is Harry's unique position. He is no ordinary litigant. He is a member of the British royal family, the son of King Charles III, the younger brother of Prince William. His identity is intertwined with institutions that have historically avoided public legal battles whenever possible. The monarchy's long-standing approach to controversy has often been described by the phrase, "never complain, never explain." Harry's approach is the opposite. He has chosen confrontation, transparency, public challenge. That contrast has defined much of his post-royal narrative. When he first began speaking openly about his grievances with sections of the British press, many people expressed empathy. There was recognition that media intrusion had played a devastating role in his mother's life. There was acknowledgement that boundaries matter. His memoir, interviews, and documentaries reinforced the idea that he saw these legal cases not just as personal defense, but as attempts to reform a culture he believes remains harmful. Yet sympathy does not automatically translate into legal victory. As details emerged from recent proceedings, analysts began dissecting the strength of the claims, the burden of proof required, and the standards the court must apply. In some instances, judges appeared cautious. In others, procedural hurdles became focal points. None of this is unusual in complex litigation. But in a case so intertwined with public perception, every cautious judicial comment can be amplified into a headline suggesting trouble. And that's where the phrase "major setback" gains traction. A setback doesn't necessarily mean defeat. It means the path forward has become more difficult. Perhaps certain arguments will need refinement. Perhaps evidence thresholds are higher than anticipated. Perhaps expectations must be recalibrated. For Harry, recalibration carries reputational implications, because over the past several years he has framed these legal fights as part of a broader stand, a moral stand. When you present your case, In moral terms, losing ground legally can feel like losing ground ethically, even if the two are distinct. There's also the undeniable political dimension. The British media landscape is powerful, entrenched, and deeply woven into the fabric of national identity. Challenging it in court is never going to be straightforward. Some see Harry as courageous for taking on institutions others fear. Others view his actions as combative or even self-serving. When court developments appear unfavorable, critics are quick to suggest that the strategy itself was flawed, that he overestimated public backing, that he underestimated institutional resilience. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that resistance from powerful entities only underscores why the fight was necessary. What complicates matters further is the broader narrative surrounding Harry's post-royal life. Since relocating to California, he and Meghan have pursued media deals, philanthropic projects, and public advocacy. Each new endeavor has been scrutinized through the lens of their departure from royal duties. For some observers, ongoing legal battles reinforce the image of a couple still entangled in conflict rather than fully transitioned into a new chapter. That perception matters, not because it determines legal outcomes, but because it shapes public patience. There's a psychological reality at play here. When a public figure repeatedly engages in high-profile disputes, even justified ones, audiences can experience fatigue. They may begin to tune out the nuances and focus instead on the pattern. Conflict becomes the headline, not the cause. In this case, the pattern intersects with Harry's personal narrative of trauma and protection. He has consistently emphasized his desire to shield his family from what he describes as relentless intrusion. Legal action, in that framing, is a protective measure, a boundary-setting tool. But courts are not therapeutic spaces. They operate on evidence, precedent, and statutory interpretation. Emotional resonance, while compelling to the public, carries limited weight before a judge. When reports describe judicial skepticism or highlight procedural complications, they feed a storyline that the case may be facing structural challenges. Those challenges can range from evidentiary thresholds to jurisdictional technicalities. And in high-profile litigation, even minor procedural losses can feel symbolic. Another layer to consider is the financial dimension. Legal battles of this magnitude are costly. They require extensive preparation, expert witnesses, and prolonged engagement. For an individual of Harry's means, financial strain may not be the primary concern, but public narratives often conflate cost with risk. The longer a case drags on, the more observers question whether the potential outcome justifies the investment. Then there is the monarchy itself. While Harry operates independently, his actions inevitably reflect on the institution he was born into. Palace officials typically avoid commenting on his legal affairs, maintaining distance. Yet every courtroom headline that includes the word prince subtly reattaches the monarchy to the story. This dynamic creates tension. Harry's quest for autonomy collides with the inescapable symbolism of his title. If this case truly represents a significant setback, the implications extend beyond legal technicalities. It would raise questions about strategy, about timing, about whether a different approach, perhaps quieter negotiation rather than public litigation, might have yielded more favorable results. At the same time, it's possible that what appears to be a stumble is simply a mid-course correction. Legal processes often involve appeals, revisions, and iterative arguments. Early skepticism does not preclude eventual success. Many landmark cases endured multiple setbacks before reaching decisive outcomes. The key question becomes one of endurance. Is Harry prepared for a prolonged, uncertain legal marathon? And equally important, is the public willing to follow that marathon without losing interest or empathy? Public opinion is volatile. It shifts not only in response to facts, but in response to tone. If future court appearances are framed as solemn, measured, and focused, sympathy may stabilize. If they are framed as dramatic showdowns, polarization may deepen. There is also the matter of credibility. Over the past few years, Harry has shared deeply personal accounts of his experiences within the royal family and with the media. Those revelations have been both praised and contested. In the courtroom credibility is scrutinized with precision. Any inconsistency, however minor, can be magnified. Observers who interpret recent developments as signs of crumbling may be reacting less to concrete legal defeat and more to the perception that the narrative control Harry once held is slipping. In the early stages of his post-royal life, he and Meghan appeared to command the conversation. Interviews set the agenda. Documentaries shaped the framing. Memoirs dominated headlines. Courtrooms, however, shift control to judges and opposing counsel. That shift can feel disorienting. Instead of narrating events, Harry becomes subject to them. Instead of choosing the moment, he must respond to procedural timelines. And this is where things become even more complicated. Because when a case starts to look unstable, even slightly, it doesn't just stay inside the courtroom. It spills into headlines, panel discussions, social media debates, and late-night commentary. The legal process may be technical and methodical, but the public reaction is emotional and immediate. The moment analysts begin using phrases like weakening position or legal hurdles, perception shifts. And perception in high-profile disputes can be just as influential as any ruling. For Prince Harry, this particular battle was never framed as just another lawsuit. It was positioned as part of a larger moral crusade, a stand against what he believes is a culture of media overreach. That framing raises the stakes dramatically, because when you attach moral weight to a legal case, any setback feels symbolic. If a judge questions the strength of an argument, critics interpret it as a rejection of the broader narrative. If a procedural issue delays progress, commentators describe it as momentum fading, and slowly, the confident storyline that once surrounded the case begins to feel less certain. That uncertainty creates space, and in that space, new questions emerge. Did he misjudge how difficult it would be to prove systemic wrongdoing? Did his team underestimate the legal thresholds required? Or was this always going to be a long, unpredictable fight from the beginning? 1. Of the realities of complex litigation is that it often looks messy from the outside. Even strong cases encounter resistance. Even compelling evidence can face rigorous scrutiny. But in celebrity cases, nuance rarely survives. Wins are exaggerated. Losses are magnified. Middle ground disappears. And right now, what observers are sensing isn't necessarily defeat, it's friction. Friction between expectation and reality. When Harry first launched his legal challenges, many supporters believed the tide of public opinion had shifted decisively in his favor. After years of intense media coverage, interviews revealing private pain, and documentaries highlighting personal struggles, there was a sense that he had reclaimed control of the narrative. Courtrooms operate differently. They don't respond to sympathy. They respond to standards of proof. They don't weigh emotional impact. They weigh admissible evidence. And when the process slows down or arguments are narrowed, it can feel anticlimactic to those expecting sweeping declarations. That gap between expectation and procedural reality is often where frustration grows. There's also the broader context of Harry's evolving public image. Since stepping back from royal duties, he has redefined himself in multiple ways: author, documentary subject, public speaker, philanthropist. Each new identity layer adds complexity to how his legal battles are perceived. Some see him as a reformer trying to modernize outdated systems. Others see him as someone unable to disengage from conflict, and when a court case appears to stumble, those competing interpretations sharpen. Supporters argue that setbacks are part of any meaningful challenge to entrenched power. Critics argue that repeated legal fights keep him tethered to the very institutions he claims to be moving beyond. Both interpretations gain fuel when proceedings become uncertain. Another dimension that can't be ignored is credibility under cross-examination. In high-profile cases, opposing counsel often probe not just facts, but consistency. Public statements made in interviews, books, or documentaries can be scrutinized alongside legal claims. Any discrepancy, however minor, can be spotlighted. That dynamic adds risk. The more a public figure has spoken openly about a subject, the more material exists for comparison. It doesn't necessarily weaken a case, but it increases complexity. And complexity is rarely headline-friendly. If this case continues encountering procedural obstacles or judicial skepticism, the narrative may shift from one of righteous challenge to one of strategic miscalculation. That shift wouldn't erase the underlying concerns Harry has raised, but it would change the tone of the conversation. Tone matters. When legal battles are framed as noble stands, patience is often extended. When they're framed as personal vendettas or ongoing grievances, patience wears thin. The question now is whether this moment marks a temporary slowdown or a genuine inflection point. A temporary slowdown could be absorbed. It could be reframed as part of a long legal process. It could even strengthen resolve. A genuine inflection point, however, would require reassessment. Would continuing the case serve the broader mission? Would scaling back signal weakness or strategic wisdom? Would pursuing appeals amplify the cause or exhaust public goodwill? These are not simple decisions. There is also the reality that legal outcomes can influence legacy. Years from now, this chapter will be condensed into a sentence or two in biographies and documentaries. He challenged the press and won. Or, he fought the system, but ultimately fell short. Those summaries may lack nuance, but they shape memory. That awareness adds pressure, because beyond the immediate headlines lies a longer arc of history. If setbacks continue, advisors may quietly recommend a pivot, focusing energy on philanthropic initiatives or policy advocacy rather than courtroom confrontations. Such a pivot wouldn't necessarily contradict his mission. It might simply reflect a different tactic. Yet stepping away from litigation after positioning it as essential would invite scrutiny. Public figures rarely get the luxury of quiet recalibration. Every move is interpreted. And so the tension deepens. So, perseverance the stronger message? Or is adaptability the wiser one? Another layer to this story involves the broader royal context. While Harry operates independently, his legal battles unfold against the backdrop of a monarchy that traditionally avoids open confrontation with the press. His willingness to litigate sets him apart sharply from the institution he was born into. If his approach falters, critics may argue that tradition proved more resilient than rebellion. If he ultimately prevails, they may say that change required breaking precedent. At this stage, however, the outcome remains uncertain. What is certain is that uncertainty itself reshapes momentum. Momentum matters in public battles. It sustains attention, funding, and morale. When momentum stalls, even temporarily, doubts creep in, doubts about strategy, doubts about timing, doubts about long-term impact. For Harry, whose public life has increasingly centered on themes of accountability and reform, managing those doubts becomes part of the challenge. He has often spoken about breaking cycles. Cycles of silence, cycles of trauma, cycles of institutional protection. Legal action was presented as one tool to break those cycles. If that tool proves less effective than anticipated, the mission doesn't necessarily collapse. But it may need refinement, and refinement requires humility. Public humility, especially after bold declarations, can be difficult. It requires acknowledging that systems are more complex than anticipated, that legal thresholds are higher. That change is slower, but humility can also restore credibility. If he acknowledges the complexity of the fight without framing every obstacle as injustice, audiences may respond with renewed respect. If instead the narrative hardens, portraying every judicial caution as bias, polarization may intensify. This is the crossroads where perception becomes pivotal. We've seen other public figures navigate similar moments. Early confidence gives way to legal resistance. Headlines shift from certainty to ambiguity, and the true test becomes not the initial claim, but the sustained response. Will he remain measured? Will he recalibrate expectations, or will he escalate rhetoric to counteract perceived setbacks? Each choice carries consequences. It's also worth noting that courts are not theaters for sweeping cultural declarations. They are arenas for specific legal questions. Even if this case narrows or encounters difficulties, it doesn't negate the broader conversation about media ethics. That conversation exists beyond any single judgment. But when one positions a case as emblematic, its outcome inevitably feels emblematic too. If this is indeed a major setback, it may ultimately serve as a reminder that systemic change rarely unfolds in dramatic courtroom victories. It often requires incremental reform, public persuasion, and long-term coalition building. Courtrooms can contribute to that process. They rarely complete it. So perhaps the most significant shift happening right now is internal rather than external. A recalculation of what success looks like. Is success a definitive legal ruling that validates every claim, or is success keeping the conversation alive even amid setbacks? If the answer leans toward the latter, then even a challenging phase could be reframed as progress. But reframing must be done carefully. Overstatement risks credibility. Understatement risks invisibility. Balance is everything. As this chapter unfolds, observers will watch not only for judicial decisions but for tone, for restraint, for evidence of strategic learning. Because setbacks, real or perceived, reveal character as much as victories do. They reveal whether conviction is rigid or resilient, whether confidence is adaptable or brittle. Right now, the word crumbles dominates headlines. It suggests collapse, instability, a structure giving way. But structures don't always fall because of one crack. Sometimes cracks prompt reinforcement. Whether this moment leads to collapse or reinforcement remains unclear. What is clear is that the path ahead looks steeper than it did at the outset. And in high-profile battles where symbolism intertwines with legality, steep paths test more than arguments. They test patience, endurance. And now we arrive at the part that really matters. Not the headline, not the dramatic word crumbles, not even the legal technicalities. What matters now is what happens next. Because setbacks, real or perceived, don't define legacies. Responses do. If this truly is a major stumble in Prince Harry's legal battle, then we're witnessing something bigger than a courtroom moment. We're watching a crossroads, a moment where strategy, emotion, reputation, and long-term vision all collide at once. For years, Harry has framed these legal fights as necessary, personal, urgent, a line drawn in the sand. And when you draw a line publicly, stepping back becomes complicated. But here's the question no one can ignore. Is pushing forward always strength? Or can recalibrating sometimes be smarter? If the case regains momentum, supporters will say persistence paid off. If it continues facing resistance, critics will argue the warning signs were there all along. And that's why this moment feels different. Because it's not just about winning or losing in court. It's about narrative control. It's about credibility. It's about whether the strategy that once looked bold now looks risky. Another question worth asking, is this fight helping Harry move forward? Or keeping him anchored to the past he says he wants to escape? Every public battle carries opportunity. Cost, time, energy, focus, public goodwill. And in today's fast-moving media world, audiences shift quickly. Sympathy can evolve into fatigue. Curiosity can turn into skepticism. So if this truly is a turning point, the next move must be intentional. Does he double down and prove critics wrong? Does he go quiet and let the process unfold, or does he pivot entirely, redirecting energy toward projects that build rather than battle? Because history tends to remember pivots more than persistence. And here's the dramatic reality. The courtroom may decide the case, but public perception will decide the legacy. Right now, the word crumbles is everywhere, but sometimes what looks like collapse is actually restructuring, and sometimes what looks like strength is simply noise. So, I want to ask you directly, do you think this is a temporary setback, or is this the beginning of a much bigger unraveling? Is Prince Harry fighting a necessary battle, or fighting a battle he can't win? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you stand on this. If you found this Breakdown insightful. Make sure you like this video. It really helps the channel grow. Share it with someone who follows royal news closely. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because this story is far from over. And if you want to understand the bigger picture behind Harry's strategy and whether he and Meghan are becoming their own worst enemies, watch the next video on your screen right now. It connects directly to everything we discussed today. Trust me, once you see that analysis, this entire court drama will make even more sense. I'll see you there.